Dr. Norton here with Jack London. Jack London was born 1876, died in 1916. His life symbolized the power of will. He was the most successful writer in America in the early 20th century. His stories of men and animals were about men and animals against the environment. Survival against the hardships were drawn mainly from his own experience. Jack London was quite an adventurer. He passed his childhood in poverty in the Oakland slums. At the age of 17, he ventured to sea on a sealing ship. The turning point of his life, according to his biographer, was a 30-day imprisonment for vagrancy and homelessness that was so degrading that it made him decide to turn to education and pursue a career in writing. He wrote this in a text about his time in prison. It's called The Road, a text he wrote. He says this: "Manhandling was merely one of the very minor, unprintable horrors of the Erie County pen. I say unprintable, and in justice I must also say undescribable. They were unthinkable to me until I saw them, and I was no spring chicken in the ways of the world and the awful abysses of human degradation. It would take a deep plummet to reach bottom in the Erie County pen, and I do but skim lightly and facetiously the surface of things as I there saw them." His first success as a writer was his first published story, To the Man on the Trail, is what the story is called. Pretty cool story about a man who is on the trail in the Yukon. In one of the magazines called The Overland Monthly, they offered him only $5 for that story, and they were slow in paying, according to London. And at that point, London came close to abandoning his writing career. Kind of a slow start. In his words, "Literally and literarily, I was saved when a story called when a publisher called The Black Cat accepted his story called 1,000 Deaths and paid him $40. It was the first money I ever received for a story," he writes. The timing of his writing career. At the time of his writing career, new printing technologies enabled lower-cost production of magazines, which helped get men like Jack London and other writers, women as well, published and going into a writing career. A boom in popular magazines aimed at a wide public and a strong market for short fiction. In 1900, Jack London made $2,500 in writing, about $66,000 in current value, and many more successes followed. Some major works and themes. His most famous novel is called The Sea Wolf. This was based on his experiences at sea. His work embraced the concepts of unconfined individualism. Unconfined individualism. Concepts of Darwinism in its exploration of the laws of nature are also found in London's works. His fiction explored several regions and different cultures: the Yukon, California, Hawaii, and the Solomon Islands. He used many different literary forms: conventional love stories, science fantasy, dystopias. A dystopia, we see this quite often in London. A dystopia is an imaginary place or state in which the condition of life is extremely bad, as from deprivation, oppression, or terror. Dystopias are often filled with pessimistic views of the ruling class or government that is brutal or uncaring, ruling with an iron hand or an iron fist. He was also a journalist for many years, and his journalism career included war correspondence, boxing stories, and the life of Molokai lepers out in the Hawaiian Islands. At the end of his career, at the end of his life, London's great passion was agriculture, and he was well on the way to creating a new model for ranching through his Beauty Ranch when he died of kidney disease at age 40. He left over 50 books of novels, stories, journalism, and essays, many of which have been translated and continue to be read around the world. Some interesting connections, I think, that are worth considering as you're reading these texts by Jack London. London's moral is that by using reason instead of intuition, modern man has allowed his primal instincts to atrophy. London, many of his characters use, as I just said, reason instead of intuition. Overuse of reason and a failure to use intuition has resulted in the atrophying of man's primal instinct. And so you'll see that. You see that in both stories, actually, that you've read for this week, but you see that in many other works by Jack London, that humanity must trust instinct and dig deep into his own instinct. What is his instinct? What is his natural inclination speaking to him about? What is it telling him? The theme of rebirth is also very common in London's works. Man realizes his mistakes and accepts his death with dignity. Definitely see that in one of the texts you read for this week. The repetitive nature of London's imagery and language functions to create an atmosphere of doom and loneliness. The repetitive nature of London's imagery. So there's a certain repetition to it. Now, part of that repetition mimics nature itself. I mentioned this in my Stephen Crane lecture about the open boat. There's a certain repetitiveness, a repetition in nature itself. But London he imitates that in his fiction as well. A repetitive nature of London's imagery and language create an atmosphere of doom and loneliness. He uses this technique to create this feeling of doom and loneliness. Often when his characters are out in the wild, in the white of nature, and that is something that London will often emphasize, that idea of the white, blank emptiness of the Yukon, of the snowy Arctic. In many ways, he's a writer of naturalist fiction, naturalism. There are naturalist elements in his work, especially focused on detailed realism, to suggest that social conditions, heredity, and environment had inescapable force in shaping human character. Social conditions, heredity, and the environment offer inescapable forces in the development or the shaping of human character. Those are key characteristics in his writing. The fifth one, Aristotelian concepts of tragedy are often found in London's work. Aristotelian concepts of tragedy. The tragic hero is a character of noble stature and has greatness. This should be readily evident in the play. The character must occupy a high status position, but must also embody nobility and virtue as part of his or her innate character. This is part of the Aristotelian concept of tragedy. Second part of that is, though the tragic hero is preeminently great, he or she is not perfect. Otherwise, the rest of us, mere mortals, would be unable to identify with the tragic hero. So it's not that kind, right? We should see him or her as someone who is essentially like us, with great potential, but also flawed, but perhaps elevated to a higher position in society. Again, another part of the Aristotelian tragic, or the Aristotelian concept of tragedy, is the hero's downfall is partially his or her own fault, the result of free choice, not of accident or villainy or some overriding malignant fate, but just his or her own fault. In fact, the tragedy is usually triggered by some error of judgment on behalf or on the part of the protagonist, the hero. This error of judgment or character flaw is known as hamartia or hamartia, and is usually translated as tragic flaw. Hamartia, Hamartia. Some scholars agree that, or argue that tragic flaw is a mistranslation of hamartia. Often the character's hamartia involves hubris, which obviously, as you know, is an overconfidence or extreme pride. The hero, in an Aristotelian tragic form, the hero's misfortune is not wholly deserved either. Although part of their downfall comes as a result of their own fault or their own mistake or their own misjudgment, not all of it is their fault. The punishment usually exceeds the crime. The fall is not pure loss, though. There is some increase in awareness, some gain in self-knowledge, some discovery on the part of the tragic hero. And though it arouses solemn emotion, the tragedy does not leave its audience in a state of depression. Aristotle argues that one function of tragedy is to arouse the unhealthy emotions of pity and fear, and through a catharsis, which comes from watching the tragic hero's terrible fate, cleanses the audience of those emotions. It's probably worth noting that Greek drama was not considered entertainment. Aristotle's writing was not considered entertainment. His view of tragedy, of the tragedy at its best, was not seen as entertainment, rather, just pure and simple entertainment. It had a communal function to contribute to the good health of the community. So a communal sense of catharsis by watching a great tragedy was very healthy for the community itself. This is why dramatic performances were a part of religious festivals and community celebrations very early in human history. London aimed to connect to this communal function in some of his work. What communal elements do you see at play in London's works that you've read? What are the communal elements? And To Build a Fire, we see a man who is, in some ways, separated from his community. He is traveling alone, but we see a man reject communal wisdom. That's an interesting situation there. So what is being rejected? Communal wisdom, and what makes this man tragic? What makes this story tragic, and how does that connect with an Aristotelian view of tragedy? In London's works, the protagonist is usually an everyman. He's punished for his transgression of natural laws and the unwritten code of the wilderness. So, in your work for today, you're reading To Build a Fire and Lost Face, as well as The Law of Life. In To Build a Fire, I mentioned already, we have a character that rejects communal wisdom. He rejects the wisdom of the old man back at the camp who says, "What do you think? You can't travel." We see a man also whose rationality, his reason, his sense of reason overrides his intuition. When in fact he should be trusting his intuition, right? Where do we see a sense of intuition? It's in the dog, right? The dog that travels with him is in some ways the foil to the man, is set up in a contrasting as a contrasting character to the man. The dog knows by intuition that they should not be out there. The dog knows by intuition, long before the man does, that the man should have been building a fire. The dog knows long before the man does what is necessary. The man is dependent upon book learning, or has made himself dependent upon book learning, and has rejected this instinctual element in his life, in his mind, in his body. The protagonist is an everyman in To Build a Fire, for sure, and he is definitely punished for his transgressions of natural laws and of the unwritten code of the wilderness. What's the other one? The Law of Life. In The Law of Life, now what about that protagonist? That old man is left behind. Now, part of what we see here is the brutality of the Yukon and what these cultures are required to do in order to continue to exist. The tradition is to leave behind the old man. He calls himself last year's branch, or last year's leaf. He's old, he's not good for anything, as he sees himself as not being good for anything in the tribe, not able to contribute like he needs to. And so, just eating and not hunting. Well, as compassionate as that might be to allow him to stay on, in fact, his eating and not hunting is a massive drain on the tribe itself, and so there's this kind of brutal kind of cutting loose. But the man accepts in a very courageous way. He accepts the reality of his situation. And what's interesting about that story is that we see man in the law of life, this old man, rise above the brute in nature. And the brute in that piece is that moose. And the moose that he witnesses as a younger man that is fighting for his life against a pack of wolves. The wolves hunt the moose down, and the moose falls. And the narrator says it's very rare to see a moose rise again once he has fallen, but this moose does. And this moose continues to fight and to kick and to claw for life and survival. Well, what's interesting is we see Jack London compare the old man to the moose. And the old man is sitting there by the fire, right? And the wolves come up, and the wolf presses his muzzle against the old man's cheek, and the old man grabs a stick out of the fire and waves it around, pushing the wolves back, until he realizes what? He realizes that he's not a dumb brute like that moose. The moose is portrayed in that story as a stupid animal, as one who lacks reason, who doesn't have the balance of reason and intuition, but is only intuition, is only survival. Does not have the composure, does not have the self-discipline to be able to integrate both reason and intuition and say, it's my time. Why am I fighting the law of life? I've been left behind because there is no reason for me to live anymore. So why would I continue to fight, claw, and kick like a dumb moose? I'm a man, and thus I will rise above my fears, my insecurities, my feeling that I should be living still, when in fact my life is over, and I can accept that and move on. That is clearly what we see portrayed in The Law of Life. Is a man who is a great hero in London's standards. Jack London would consider this old man a great hero. What other connections do we see in this thing? We see his primal instincts have not atrophied. He has great primal instincts, but he also has great reason, and they blend. The man accepts his death with dignity. There is a certain doom and loneliness the man experiences out there alone in the Yukon. And then this where do you see Aristotelian concepts of tragedy at play in The Law of Life? In some ways, we see the man learning from his own mistake in judgment. As he first waves around the fiery brand, he puts it down. What is it that makes him pick that stick up? It's his own pride. But he puts it down, and he accepts his fate. There's an increase in his awareness, a gain in self-knowledge, and in that short story, in many ways, a discovery on the part of this tragic hero. And it is a bit tragic, isn't it? It's a tough one. You could make an argument for euthanasia by arguing for the logic in Jack London's Law of Life. And I definitely disagree with that. I definitely disagree with what is presented, but how it's presented and the clarity with which it is presented is noteworthy, is worthy of study. In Lost Face is a fun read. In some similar ways, we have a lot of these same elements at play. And at the same time, this desire to be justified, this desire for this man not to be tortured, and for him to maintain control. That's kind of the key element here that we see in all three of these stories, right? In To Build a Fire, we see a man who's lost control. He's lost control of his life, he's lost control of his wits, he's lost control altogether. And so he is seen as a fool, a great fool. Second story, we see a man lose his wits, the old man, in The Law of Life, but then regain them, which makes him heroic. In a very Aristotelian way, he is redeemed as heroic in London's economy. In the third story, the man in Lost Face, if he doesn't have control or regain control of the situation, he will be tortured miserably. And this story, I love the ending, is fantastic. The story of him putting the special cream or the medicine on his neck, right, that will make the axe bounce off. What we see this man do is regain control of his situation. And this is, again, another typical kind of London hero who has control of his environment. And he does. He gains or regains control of his environment. He's lost control, and then he regains it. And he maintains control. And even though he's killed, he dies with control in some ways. All right, I hope you enjoy London, and I hope you read many more London stories. The online database that I pointed you to on the syllabus has, as you can see, many great works by London. And I'm a great fan of London. I think he's very fun to read. On many levels, spiritually, I disagree with London, but I think he's a great artist. And I enjoy discussing his work because it points to the human condition in a very practical, realistic way. His naturalism is very poignant and rich, and his imagery and his characterization are fun to read and to discuss. So I hope you enjoyed it too. See you next time.